Good evening, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and in this video I'm going to explain why Gaelic nationalism is wrong. Incidentally, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so bear with me. When I say it's wrong, I don't suggest it's wicked, just that it's ahistorical, and this is why I disagree with it. And for Irish nationalism, one can really read Gaelic nationalism. I remember Arlene Foster, about 20 years ago, long before she was First Minister, stating that she was against Gaelic nationalism, and I thought she's hit the nail on the head. That's really what it is. It was about the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Gaelic League, and so forth, and this atavism constantly harking back to the early Middle Ages, even to the Dark Ages. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because the crucial thing is that the Gaelic era and Gaelic heritage is only a small part of Ireland's past. So let's look back to the 1170s, because Irish nationalists tend to believe that Ireland's political connection with England and later with Wales and Scotland was calamitous, immoral, should be broken, and nothing remotely positive was derived therefrom. So the core mythologies of Irish nationalism are to suggest that in the 1170s Ireland was fully independent, or fully united, or fully Irish-speaking, or indeed was Catholic. So Irish nationalism, as we know it, is really an invention of the 1790s. And it's mainly middle-class Protestant intellectuals on the East Coast who invented it. There's nothing wrong with belonging to any of those groups, but it just shows how atypical they were of Irish society. Of course, most people in Ireland by the 1790s were Irish-speaking and Catholic, and didn't live on the East Coast. That's another notable thing, is for many centuries there's been a large community in Ireland which has not been regarded by itself or anyone else as being Irish. And I suppose those people in Northern Ireland who say that they're British and think that's different from being Irish, that's them now. There was an English community on the east coast of Ireland from the 1170s into the early 18th century who did not regard themselves as Irish. Prior to that, we had a large Danish community. So remember, before Henry II arrived in Ireland, a large part of Ireland had been Danish ruled. Our cities were founded by the Danes. I say Danes, it's difficult to distinguish between Danes and Norwegians at that time. There's just been a DNA study come out today showing that our Viking ancestry is much greater than previously been realised. So I look at myself as a case in point. I'm a typical Irishman in that if I look at the surnames of my family, about 3/4 of them are Gaelic. So obviously one only bears the surname of one's father's father's father, and look back at all the other ones, I don't know that much. I don't know that many so far back. Of course, go back more than 8 generations, that's over 1,000 ancestors, assuming that it increases by doubling each time. However, sometimes distant cousins get married, so one doesn't have quite so many individual ancestors as one might imagine. So Irish nationalism harks back to before the 1170s as the halcyon days, but that wasn't the case. We're divided into several different kingdoms. There was ceaseless warfare between them. Though we did have a high king, there was no dynasty as such. The different kingly dynasties battled it out every few years for the apex position. So people often enlisted foreign support, the support of the Danes against other Irishmen, and indeed bringing in a Cambro-Normans strongbow. That was no different. Henry II, his overlord, followed not much long afterwards, and of course he married Aoife, the daughter of Dermot McMurrough, no different from marrying in with the Danes. So got a lot of Danish and Norwegian blood. So the so-called separatists are very often trying to unite us with other countries. There's the astonishing thing. In the 1590s, well, we had the Munster Rebellion and the Ulster Rebellion. Sorry, other way around, I mean. And Philip II of Spain was assisting said troops at the Battle of Kinsale. People overlook the fact that Philip II of Spain styled himself King of Ireland, and indeed he was King of Ireland. He'd been married to Mary Tudor, who was Queen of Ireland, so he wanted to rule Ireland, and the Spanish Armada was about that. When his men landed at Smerwick, they're given short shrift and killed by the locals. In fact, some of them killed after they surrendered, which shouldn't have been done, but that's the way it was in the 16th century, very inhumane. The English army did likewise. So of course, in the 1790s, the United Irishmen brought in the French army. Now, one would have to be very naive to imagine that Napoleon had any intention of giving us independence, although of course he wasn't first consul in 1798. France had annexed many other countries. Later on, Napoleon put his sisters and brothers on the various thrones of Europe. So had the French succeeded, we would have been a satrapy of France. That might have been an improvement. If I'd been around in the 1790s, perhaps I would have been a Republican too, because of course the majority we were legally discriminated against at the time. The French would at least sorted out that. In the 20th century, the IRA were very eager to bring in the German army in 1916. Later on, in 1940, they would have welcomed the North anyway. Having invited them in, one would have had a very tough time getting them out, and then we would have learnt the real meaning of brutality if it was an insurrection against the Wehrmacht. The IRA was obviously funded and armed by individuals in the United States, not the US government, from the 70s onwards, and indeed Libya, an unholy alliance between Irish Americans, most of whom would absolutely abominate Gaddafi, and Gaddafi, who was an ultra-left socialist who detested the USA, but anything for Anglophobia. And now we have Euro-nationalism. It's gone full circle. So most people want to be part of the European Union, and that's just another nationalism. Not necessarily a bad one. I would rather the Republican one that we pulled out of the EU and rejoined the UK. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm not saying the EU is evil. That's a whole other video, but I do have many objections to it. So it's astonishing the way that nationalism in a sense doesn't exist anymore. Absolutely nobody wants Ireland to be independent. Even the dissident Republicans want us to be part of a confederation of Celtic nations along with Cornwall, Brittany, Scotland, Wales and so forth. So the nationalists often wanted us to be preserved in aspect from the 8th century AD. That was before the Danes arrived. And the astonishing thing is they think the Gaels, who dominated us for just a few centuries, that they hold the title deeds to Ireland, and let's say 8.5 centuries of more recent connection to England and Wales, and latterly Scotland, doesn't confer any legitimacy whatsoever. Notably, the Gaels were not the first people in Ireland. Irish is not the original language of Ireland. There were other Celtic languages before that, P rather than Q Celtics. And St. Patrick was not sent by the Pope. That's a later accretion from the Middle Ages. So Henry II brought us back into Catholicism. Well, not back, to Catholicism for the first time, saying Mass in Latin. Lord Abilita, Adrian IV, the only English Pope, had authorised him to do so, saying, got to beg him to pay Peter's pence and recognise the right date of Easter and disallow clerical marriage and so forth. Now, I'm indifferent as to that, but it's something which a lot of Irish Catholics who are nationalists wouldn't like to face up to. So tales of a Gilded Age are largely bogus, which is not to say that our connection to England was all sweetness and light. Remember, the ancient Britons in the 4th century AD and 5th century AD fled the Angles and Saxons and came to Ireland. So in that sense, we are the ancient Britons. We're rather their stock. I've heard it said to me, well then, are the British Germans then, because the Angles and Saxons came from Germany? That's not comparing like with like, because there's no concept of Germany as a country. The Germans, well, the Germanii were a certain tribe that was so named by the Romans, and they were a small group on the Rhine. And Germania didn't refer to the whole of Germany. The Germans had no notion that they were German for several centuries after that. So you should read Anderson's Imagined Communities. All countries are imagined to a lesser or greater extent, and Ireland's no exception. There's been certain erasure of our Welsh, our Scots, and particularly our English stock. People will sometimes acknowledge commonality with Wales and Scotland, so long as that leads them to exclude and demonise the English. So, like almost everyone in Ireland, I have some Welsh and English ancestry, so far as I know, not at all Scots. So, yes, my heritage is mainly Gaelic. It could be that I would discover that my Welsh and English surnames are a mistake, and I'm Gaelic through and through, but that wouldn't change my opinion. My ethnicity's got nothing to do with it. We're not really even separate ethnicities anyway, because obviously our culture has blended, and we have drawn on their culture as we've transmitted memes to our Welsh, Scots and English kith and kin. So English and Welsh soldiers arrived in Ireland at the invitation of the King of Leinster. Later on, Irish Republicans were to issue invitations to other foreign leaders to send their troops into Ireland, which they think was entirely acceptable, but they often think it was the ultimate betrayal of Dermot McMurrough to enlist the military aid of a foreign potentate. So those are some of the reasons that I'm against Gaelic nationalism. I don't reject the nationalist narrative entirely. I realise it's not a monolith. nor is unionism a monolith, and I'm not a typical unionist. I'm not responsible for what any unionist has ever done. And in another video, I could, of course, castigate some aspects of unionist discourse and conduct of unionists as well. I could go on for hours, but that's just a taste of my opinion.